everyone. Welcome. My name is Erin Corcoran, and I'm the Executive Director of the Kroc Institute International Peace Studies here at the Keough School of Global Affairs. And we're really excited to have you all here this afternoon. We're going to be talking about combating human trafficking policies and practices and advancements. Just want to give you a brief overview of the format and sort of how we're going to proceed. And we'll introduce our speakers briefly. But before we get started, I would like to go ahead and take a moment to do our Kroc Institute land acknowledgement. We acknowledge the Kroc Institute's presence on traditional homelands of Native peoples, particularly the Pohegan Potawatomi, who have been using this land for thousands of years and continue to do so. We recognize our own place in the story and practices of colonialism and understand that our responsibilities extend beyond this gesture of land acknowledgement. We must also reflect on the University of Notre Dame's past, present, and future relationship with the original stewards of this land and actively pursue ways to amend this troubled relationship. We also know that a land acknowledgement alone would be meaningless if it is not accompanied by active work to address the structural injustice and violence perpetrated against Indigenous people around the globe, both historically and currently. The Kroc Institute is committed to working to addressing these harms and to find ways to contribute to constructive transformation through our teaching, research, and peace-building efforts. We hope today that this conversation will honor traditions of these Native people as we sort of begin to talk about the vulnerability of migrants and those who have been victims of human trafficking. Thank you very much. So the format today is going to be, we have myself, Mica to my right, and Cory Smith at the end. We're each going to spend about 10 to 15 minutes talking on a particular issue around human trafficking or migration. And then after that, we'll open it up to Q&A and sort of be in conversation. But before that, I did want to take a moment just to introduce both of our guests here today. Micaela Garrido, who goes by Mica, is here with us at Notre Dame at the Kroc Institute this spring. She's a graduate of a 2006 class of Masters of Peace Studies, and she's this year's Alumni Visiting Fellow. The Alumni Visiting Fellow Research Fellowship is intended for Kroc Institute alumni who have pursued careers as peace-building practitioners and who seek to come back here to reflect on and write about their work while in residence here at the Institute. And during her time here this semester, she's been working on developing her research on the impact of COVID-19 to the experience of migrant workers in Southeast Asia in the hopes for publication. She's also developing course offerings at DePaul University covering genocide, violence, trauma, and human trafficking, which are subtopics in her current course offering international conflict and peace building. It's really great to have her here with us this semester in residence. And then Cory Smith is an adjunct associate teaching professor here at the Keough School for Global Affairs. He's currently teaching a course on human trafficking for undergraduate students. And he also has, I'm not going to go over his entire CV, but he has considerable amount of experience in the DC policy world on a variety of different issues, ranging from working with unaccompanied migrant children as part of Kids in Need of Defense, where he was vice president of policy, advocacy, and communications for several years. Prior to that, he also worked for a TEST, which was a coalition funded by Humanity United who worked on human trafficking issues, particularly on federal policy. And he was the senior government relations and policy consultant for that project. He's also worked on a variety of human rights organizations, working on human rights abuses, security, post 9/11 policies, and refugees and asylum. So I think his sort of expertise really is how do you get policymakers' attention around issues around human rights, and then in his case, human trafficking. How can you provide effective solutions that are workable and measurable? So I'm going to first start off the conversation today. I'm trained as a lawyer, and before being a law professor and then coming to the University of Notre Dame, I worked in policy, and I also did direct service work representing asylum seekers, victims of human trafficking, and refugees in immigration court and federal court. And I thought today I would start off the conversation by really just giving you all a basic overview of US migration policy. And I think it's really important to situate that in this conversation because it demonstrates sort of a lack of viable options for people who want to come to the United States to work and live, which can make them particularly susceptible to human trafficking. And then I'll let the experts on human trafficking really talk more about what human trafficking is, how it's defined, and how victims can get assistance and how we can prosecute combat trafficking. Lately in the news, we've seen lots of what's going on the southwest border. We're seeing an increase of individuals coming to the southwest border, but not just from places like Mexico or even the Northern Triangle, also, which is Central America, El Salvador, Honduras, Guatemala. But we're also seeing an increase in people coming from Haiti, even places like Afghanistan. Often of them are trying to seek protection or safe havens in the United States. But we have a pretty militarized border in the Southwest, and it's very, very hard to even get access to our asylum and refugee system. So I think once a person is able to actually access that system, they may be able to get protection in the United States. But what we've seen over the last 10 years or so is the sort of intentional pushing back of asylum seekers and refugees from the into Mexico, where they're remaining oftentimes for months or even a year at large, waiting to have their cases adjudicated. And now they're also required to actually get an appointment on the Mexican border side, even to speak with a U.S. asylum officer. And so what we have seen is people are in makeshift camps that are not even being facilitated by the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. We're seeing them living in dangerous situations, oftentimes, months at a time. The other thing I think it's also important to think about is there's not very many pathways to come to the United States legally. If you want to come permanently, and even if you want to come and be a tourist or come to vacation here, it can also be really hard even to get a visa to come as a visitor. So the main avenues for which people can come and seek permanent status, there's basically 4 avenues to do so. One is family-based immigration. And so if you have a U.S. family member who is a U.S. citizen or has what we call a permanent resident status, they are able to petition for their children and their spouse. And if you're a U.S. citizen, you can also petition for your parents and your siblings. But the wait times for that can be up to 20 years or even longer if you're coming from certain countries. So particularly the Philippines or Mexico, countries where we have a large number. So that's one main avenue. A second avenue is work-based immigration. And again, in the United States, there's a real premium that I would say is put on higher educated. So I would say we want the best and the brightest to come to the United States to work. So typically people who are eligible to get what you would call would be an H-1B visa, which can lead to permanent immigration status. Again, if you have to have an advanced degree, you have to have a sponsoring organization, a university, you actually have to show that no one else can do what you can do in that job, American workers. So then I would call, there's like a catch-all that I would call humanitarian. And this is where asylum and refugee law comes into place, and also where victims, non-US citizen victims of human trafficking can avail themselves of some limited protections. And then also there's something called temporary protected status, which is another form of humanitarian relief that's offered to non-permanent offered to people who are fleeing natural disaster or civil war or human rights violations. But again, that relief is dependent on Congress or the president declaring a country, or people from a certain country can access that relief. So I want to spend a little time talking about the definition of, and then finally the 4th category is literally a lottery. We have what we call a diversity lottery, where you can, if you're from certain countries, you can throw your name in a hat to say, and you could be picked out, and then you can be put on a path to a green card. So just a little bit of time on who qualifies for refugee protection, because I think that's something we've heard a lot about in the news, and what is an asylum seeker. What is asylum? What is asking for asylum mean? So asking for asylum is the process by which a person is asking the U.S. government to recognize them as a refugee under international law and under U.S. domestic law. And I think what's important to recognize about the definition of who qualifies for refugee protection, it's pretty narrow in scope and it's somewhat antiquated and dated. Mostly it's reflective of post World War II Europe, sort of who was fleeing persecution and harm in Europe at the time. And so in order to qualify for refugee protection or asylum, you have to be outside of your country of origin. So if you're in your country and there's massive human rights violations occurring or you're being targeted, you can't ask for protection from another country while you stay in your own country, right? So by definition, you have to migrate to seek protection, by definition under international law. You also have to demonstrate that the reason that you're fleeing harm is because you fear or that you're going to be persecuted, which is a pretty high standard. So persecution is severe harm, grave harm, not just discrimination, or oftentimes not just low-level imprisonment. It has to kind of rise to a level of severity. And you have to show that the harm is being perpetrated on you either by a government actor, so someone in the government, a repressive government regime, or someone that the government is unable or unwilling to control. So armed militia, rebel forces that the government can't control. And you have to show that that persecution is based on one of 5 reasons. So race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, or political opinion. So who is not covered in that definition? People who are fleeing generalized war, people who are fleeing civil war, because oftentimes they're not being targeted for one of those 5 protected reasons. Secondly, it doesn't provide protection for people who are fleeing natural disaster. And what we've also seen, it has no provisions at all for people who are fleeing any kind of climate injustice or climate violence, or environmental degradation right now. And so what does that mean for people who have legitimate concerns for their own safety or their own family's safety, and can't apply for protection in their home country? It means they often take really dangerous and arduous routes to other countries in search of protection. And that's what we're seeing happening right now on the southwest border of the United States. The country of Haiti is right now, we just did a panel on this a couple weeks ago. It is really in turmoil right now, and Haitians are continuing to try to flee and seek protection. The U.S. just deported 50 Haitians the other day back to Haiti. The Dominican Republic, which is the neighboring country and on the same island of Haiti, has basically closed its border for protection for Haitians. So people are fleeing really grave violence and are in search of safety, and there's very limited avenues for protection, which can at times make them incredibly vulnerable for human trafficking. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mica to give her sort of thoughts and on this situation.
Okay. Oh, sorry. Okay, hi everyone. Again, my name is Cayton Garrido, and I think before I jump into my slides, I'd like to kind of go into a bit of a backgrounder about my own work in this area of labor exploitation, trafficking, immigration, and human trafficking. So before coming to Notre Dame, I was conducting research on COVID-19 and migrant worker welfare in Southeast Asia. And really what propelled that was my work in Chicago, being a part of the Building Society. And I was the principal investigator for Department of Justice grant under the Office of Victims of Crime, trying to bridge the gap between vulnerable communities to help identify and address labor trafficking. And so coming from a human rights model, what we did was we conducted outreach throughout the state, and I actually conducted outreach even in border areas of other states such as Iowa, Missouri, Indiana, to reach worker or community groups that would be particularly vulnerable because of the kind of work that they did, for immigration reasons, their access to social safety nets and the like. Now, so much of this meant that we were doing a lot of work with communities that were located in remote areas, so agricultural sector or factories that were kind of in rural locations that were doing food processing and whatnot, aside from many other community based outreach. Now, when COVID hit March of 2020, if it's all right, I take us all back there in that space. Sorry in advance, but if we can remember the kind of suddenly feeling like we are paralyzed with what to do. Does me being in proximity of another person mean that I might get it? Does paper help with the infection? Does that distribute the virus to another person? These kinds of fears and the unknown, right? But to me, being in that space meant that, oh my goodness, the kind of work that people in these industries do is just so susceptible to infection. Because in food processing, it's literally side by side. You have a couple of seconds to process the product, the produce, the chicken, the meat, whatever, before it goes to the next person. And there's no other way that it was set up. It was made to be as efficient as possible. In the agricultural sector, it's not just in the US, worldwide, the agricultural sector is hugely reliant on migrant workers. And so in the US, we have, hundreds of thousands of H-2A visas that are made available for recruiting farm workers to work in the US. And then the H-2B visa, which is for food processing. So March of 2020, everything else was suspended. The other kinds of work, such as landscaping, carnivals, things like that. But what were classified as essential, which, to be grateful really to preserve the food chain supply for the country, was these individuals. And so what happened was you already had this kind of visa situation that would never ripen into citizenship, that was contract-based, that would last maybe 6 months, a year, depending on the needs of the employer, that is tied to the employer. But now in order to address that humongous shortage, because again, majority of the individuals that were working in these spaces were from other countries. And with all of the borders being shut down, no flights out, the desperation meant that they had to make these visas more portable. So in the outset, especially in agricultural and food processing, even pre-COVID, there was a lot of movement in between states for these workers, but especially so during COVID. And that freaked me out because I was thinking, oh my gosh, the way migrant worker workplaces are set up is they live in the same place, they're transported in the same bus or van, they work in the same whether factory or space, even if it's outdoors, and then they do it all over again for however long. And so it's just so ripe for infections. The problem that happened here was, at least me, I felt like I was panicking because it was, okay, we're saying that these are essential workers, but there are no safety measures to ensure that they are going to be safe. Okay, I think some policies in some states said, we'll have a plastic tarp in between workers in the food processing plant so that, fine, they're less than 6 feet beside each other, but there's that plastic tarp, which really doesn't do anything. So anyway, with that, I'm gonna go to this slide that shows this reliance on migrant work. It's a global phenomenon, and really, it's just gonna keep going. In 2022, in 2021, I was seeing the desperation of not having enough workers to work certain sectors in some countries, where the garbage collectors, the call was, why don't we hire migrant workers to do this? healthcare especially was a huge one, right? In fact, in the Philippines, the then president had to put an ultimatum or a stop to the visas that were being processed for healthcare workers in the Philippines because all no, they wanted to make sure that they had healthcare workers to address their own populations instead of leaving. So according to the ILO, this is the latest data available from 2021, so it's pre-COVID. But even then, almost 170 million international migrant workers in the world, 99 million men, 70 million women, and they're distributed. If we think about the Americas, so it's right there. Sorry, one second. Where do I see it? So it's almost a quarter for the Americas. And especially for the US, again, a large reliance on the kind of work that we would say it's hard to recruit individuals to do that work. And so for the H-2A visa, there's no cap that the federal government puts to that. And then for the H-2B, we have something like 66,000, which, you know, every time in legislation and federal Congress, there's always an attempt to try and raise that cap in order to address the shortage of labor in the US is what it's called. Now, so I want to kind of hone into this issue around push-pull factors of migration and really think about the vulnerabilities of migrant work overlapping with COVID-19. I don't say that there is always labor exploitation. I'm saying that because of the nature of their situation, there is less safety nets for this worker population. And you know, the many economic, social, and physical reasons, physical reasons why people emigrate can usually be classified into push-pull factors, which is the push factor is the reason why a person leaves the location or country of origin, and then the pull factors is the reason to move into the location or country of destination. And for migrant workers, the pull factor is always, you know, the promise of better pay or the promise of an actual job that they are able to have a job and opportunities compared to the location of origin. So if you have a scenario where we didn't know how infectious this was, we didn't know how to address it. At the same time, there's this humongous need around food and how to address that demand. Kind of made it so that we had to, at least me included, had to do a lot of advocacy work at the state and federal level in order to address the safety measures that were necessary for this population. Because at that point in time, the official CDC guidance was, there wasn't much of a guidance. It was more of, we're leaving it up to the employers to figure this out. But we felt like this really does not address the vulnerabilities of this group of workers who are, more often than not, they are from another location or another country. They don't know, they don't have the safety nets or the social networks or the understanding or ability to even tap into resources in case they got sick or whatever, what have you. So based on some data that was published, and I can, if anyone is interested in this publication and this research, it does show that the estimated cumulative number of COVID-19 cases, or specifically deaths in the agricultural sector, was almost 10% of the proportion of the total number of agricultural workers or in that sector. So I'm not just saying migrant workers, I'm also saying, you know, these are the actual producers, hired workers, unpaid workers, and migrant workers. Over 9% in relation to the total population of that industry. So it's a pretty high ratio during COVID. And so again, thinking about the fact that this was an essential industry, this was an essential sector, it just showed us how vulnerable that community was or that industry is, if there are no proper regulations in place, occupational safety and health regulations in place in light of COVID. So we do have those safety and health regulations that were already existing, like what's the quality of the beds, what's the quality of the bus. There were those scenarios, but there was nothing that envisioned this kind of very infectious situation that COVID had presented us. So this is an example of, it's pretty small, but this is an example of one of the worst situations where in Florida, Doctors Without Borders was actually asked to help out because in specifically a location called Immokalee, which is a huge agricultural sector, approximately 15,000 to 20,000 migrant farm workers continued to work during the pandemic with minimal access to healthcare and testing. Beginning in early May of 2020, MSF ran a public health education campaign, mobile testing clinics, in collaboration with the Coalition for Immokalee Workers in order to help them understand what they can do to make themselves safe, but also to have that testing because in the industry, it's a no work, no pay. And at the same time, people needed to know whether they were infected so that they could isolate and that hopefully the farm had a place where they could isolate and get better instead of potentially infecting their coworkers. So eventually MSF completed the handover of its COVID-19 testing and public health program to the county health departments a few months later. So now the personal experience I had was when I was going around Illinois, Missouri, Iowa, Indiana, was that when I would, chat with people like the way I would do things, I would always get asked about medical issues. I would always get asked about how can I access this, how can I access that, and then eventually when the vaccine was available, how they could access the vaccine. The other vulnerability with this group of workers is how they move between states and how things were different from one state to another, where in one state, if they tried to access public health care, they could be jailed, deported, or that was the threat. In another, they were classified as essential workers, and because they were classified as essential workers, then they were a priority in the vaccine status or a vaccine list, which wasn't, again, necessarily the case from state to state. I had some workers who would say that their paycheck was withheld by, in this other state, how can I help them? So again, that portability exacerbated the situation. Polaris Project is the nonprofit that operates the National Human Trafficking Healthline, and the daily number of labor trafficking and exploitation situations reported to the hotline that had at least one victim on an H-2 visa, again in 2020, doubled for the 6-month period during the pandemic. And more than 1/3 of victims on H-2A visas reported being denied medical care despite their classification as essential workers. And so various studies had found that Latinos in general and farm workers in particular were disproportionately likely to become seriously ill or die of COVID-19 at the height of the pandemic. So moving to this other phenomenon that I kind of was involved in as well, which was workers who lost their jobs during the pandemic were recruited into scenarios that eventually ended up in forced criminality scenarios, specifically working in cannabis farms that were unregulated or illegally operating, and eventually they were trafficked or exploited. So the workers didn't know the operation or product was illegal, but also they couldn't leave because, again, very remote scenarios. This one case in New Mexico was layer upon layer of complication because it was in native land. The operation was operated in partnership with an individual who lived there. Over 1,000 workers were recruited Chinese specifically who had lost their jobs in restaurants, in various establishments around the state, around the US actually. So they were recruited from Chicago, Los Angeles, New York City. And vague and alluring offers, for example, would be published on this platform called WeChat. I don't know if anyone is familiar with, it's an app, a communication app that's mostly in Mandarin. And the recruitment posts would be something like this: earn $70 for every pound of flowers you trim from 4 p.m. to 4 a.m. Lodging and transportation from LA provided. And then another one would say $180 a day, we can leave tonight. And again, there was this understanding that cannabis is being, it's no longer illegal. So they were doing something that would be hopefully, solve their problems of not having a job, and it's lucrative. Some of them were invited to invest. Now, it wasn't just these mostly Chinese immigrant workers that were recruited into this situation. During the summer, a group of local kids would also wake up at sunrise and arrive at the farm by 7:30, work 10-hour shifts under the sun. And many of them were 13, 14-year-olds, lured by offers of quick cash, and a few were as young as 10-year-olds. This kind of scenario was found to be being also a scenario that was happening in other states: Oregon, California, Colorado. And the major concerns were the kind of exploitation and abuse that the workers suffered. Many of them because a good number of these operations were illegal or were not complying with EPA standards or environmental permits. So the workers would be sleeping or working beside very, poisonous chemicals and whatnot. And a lot of them ended up not getting paid. Some areas that where investigation happened, they would find bodies that were just left out because these people died and they just couldn't keep up with the work. In this New Mexico case specifically, 15 workers filed a civil suit where they alleged, or they said, which I believe, that their phones and car keys were taken away, they were barred from leaving, family members were separated, and then in a motel nearby was where they were housed, but they were treated like prisoners because it was watched by armed security guards, and these security guards will also watch them while toiling in the fields. So this forced criminality scenario during COVID also happened, at least in my research, when I was doing this research in Southeast Asia. I went into this research wanting to do research from an occupational safety and health perspective around COVID-19 and migrant worker welfare, coming from my experience here. And before I was working in Chicago, I actually worked in Singapore on migrant worker welfare as well. So I just wanted to go back and see how the region was responding to this issue of the necessities of work, the essential workers, the industries, and how migrant workers were coping, how the movement was going. But I ended up getting into research that inevitably led to labor trafficking and human trafficking. One major issue was this one. So has anyone received any weird texts lately? Yes. What kind of texts were they?
Offering me jobs.
Offering you jobs? Anyone else? Texts, phone calls? Anyone slide into your DMs? No?
I've gotten phone calls in Chinese
Okay, yeah.
out of the blue.
Yeah. So, I think this is just a reflection of how our lives became hugely online, right? We really relied on online spaces to continue working, to continue engaging, and so did criminal activity. Now, what happened here was, again, in the region, migrant workers were recruited for ostensibly high-tech industry work. But what happened was, there were a number of recovery operations conducted in various countries in Southeast Asia, where they would have, maybe 1,000 victims, 3,000 victims from countries all over the world who were migrant workers from other countries, China, even Africa, Europe, North America. These victims were recruited to work in call center positions or in supposedly tech services. They were promised good working conditions. Some of them were recruited over social media or online jobs boards. Eventually, they were forced to get involved in what is called pig butchering, if this is a word anyone's. So pig butchering is kind of, you fatten the pig before you slaughter it, is what that means. So it's cryptocurrency or romance scams. And some of them were sophisticated that they even have apps to show, look at your cryptocurrency based on this app, it's doing this kind of, so what was interesting with this phenomenon was that a good number of the workers were young, they were college graduates, they were bilingual in English and another language, and they were very tech savvy. Some of them were creating these apps. Some of them had software engineering backgrounds, computers, science backgrounds. So this victim demographic dispelled the typical list of vulnerabilities we know of human trafficking victims other than one issue, which is migration. So they would be promised to work in one area, after they're fluent, they're brought to another. So as we were forced to rely on cyber online ways of connecting, so did human trafficking. This ProPublica investigative report in 2022 even published some posts in this app called Telegram. I don't know if anyone's familiar. It's just like WeChat, it's just like WhatsApp. But Telegram had posts like this. Selling a Chinese man in Sihanoukville, which is in Cambodia, just smuggled from China, 22 years old with an ID card, typing very slow. Listing $10,000 is the price. Another began, Cambodia, Sihanoukville, 6 Bangladeshis can type and speak English. So like handles of the days of American slavery, the channel also included offers of bounties for people who had run away, which is an issue I had seen in areas in Chicago as well. And so last slide is this infographic created by the Urban Institute to help visualize the spectrum of exploitation. And in this study, the more indicators mentioned by the respondents in the research, the greater indicia of labor trafficking. The research found that immigration status was a powerful form of control. So COVID definitely exacerbated the vulnerabilities of migration with that. And I'll turn it over to Stefan.
Great. Am I on? Okay. Hi, everyone. Thanks for taking the time to come on. Thanks for those of you that helped organize this panel. Really appreciate it. So I'm going to talk just a little bit about some possible solutions, in the policy realm on the federal level. This will come a little bit later. But based on my work on human trafficking, and I call myself like an action leader, I'm not a thought leader. I take thought leaders' thoughts, if they're good thoughts, and try to make them into action and policy and change. I'm going to talk about some solutions, some policy solutions. These have been around for a while. They're very kind of common knowledge as issues and concerns among addressing labor trafficking, particularly given the non-immigrant visas like the H-2As and H-2Bs that Mica just talked about. I'm also not going to mention these kind of in any kind of sense of feasibility. If you have questions, I can kind of go through kind of what I think is most possible given the current political landscape and the federal government of the U.S., the Congress, and the administration. And so, a couple of things I would say, kind of 3 broad areas when I look at the issue of exploitation and the migrants. One, there's a serious chronic issue with foreign labor recruiters or contractors. And these are individuals that are hired to facilitate acquiring labor and getting them from one country to the other. There's a lot of the foreign labor recruiters, the majority of them are good actors. They act within the system, but there's certainly a significant number of labor recruiters that are bad actors. And one of the things that has been long sought is some basic transparency for the foreign labor recruiters. There's interest in having a list where they would register with the Department of Labor, which I think is a pretty light regulatory touch and would be helpful. Also to abolish fees. A lot of the foreign labor recruiters will charge these low-skilled, no-skilled workers that have very, very limited means, exorbitant fees, and then they end up in a position of debt servitude. And that increases their vulnerability. You have a lot of manipulation with that debt. You know, these individuals come, of course, they want to make money for themselves for a livelihood. They also, of course, send money back to their families. So there's a lot riding on them keeping this job. False promises are another big problem. We see this all the time. It's almost like there's a manual for foreign labor recruiters to exploit and abuse. They'll say, you know, you're going to have this great job with this money in this place. The individual arrives and it's a completely different bill of goods. So often there's no contract, no employee contract, so it needs to be contracts, and they also need to be in the language of the individual. Know your rights presentation, again, also should be in the language of the individual. Again, banning fees is a big problem. At the very least, they should have requirements that they're reasonable fees if they can't in the kind of current political environment. And I will say that for years, there's been attempts to pass standalone legislation on foreign labor recruiters. I've been part of those efforts. I would say at least 15 years. They've also tried to fold them into the big trafficking bill that's known as the Trafficking Victim Protection Act. This is the big overarching bill that is passed every few years to make changes and updates. It was first passed in 2000, and there's been updates about every 3 to 4 years since then. There's been attempts to include language with registration, transparency, reporting requirements, banning fees, and they've been opposed and thwarted by a lot of business interests, and successfully they have been able to oppose them. The other thing too is that you need enforcement. You know, if there are violations, you need to have real enforcement. And and this is one of the big secrets. And I'm going to talk about this a little bit too, but one of the ways you can kind of test out your member of Congress, your senator, if you want to see about their commitment to human trafficking, because every member of Congress will say, I'm for, you know, eradicating the scourge of human trafficking. Well, you know, first of all, are they for both ending sex and labor trafficking? A lot of times there's an exclusive focus on sex trafficking. Both are horrific. You know, there's no hierarchy here. They're both based, you know, you should have a holistic approach based on the need. 2, do they address both U.S. citizens and foreign nationals? And that's another big area. And then 3, that, you know, other tests I give is like, you may support, co-sponsor, vote for laws that provide due authorities, whether it's for victim services, survivor aftercare, for law enforcement. That's great, thank you. But do you support funding? And a lot of times they won't. And so, of course, what can you do without funding? And what I'm getting to here with the foreign labor recruiters is there's a real absence of federal funding to address the issue of labor trafficking. And it's really astounding when you look at the stats for Department of Labor and the wage and hour and health and safety inspectors, and how the numbers, you know, in the last 25, 30 years have continued to climb up with greater numbers of individuals coming, for example, through the H2 and H2B. But the level of inspectors and the funding is behind the level, the numbers has remained flat. So there's a really, really big challenge. And let me just give you a sense of some of the stats and actual facts. So in 1978, each investigator was responsible for 69,000 workers. By 2018, the responsibility for each investigator more than doubled to 175,000 workers. There are 780 investigators responsible for protecting 148 million employees in 2019. This is especially troubling over the last 10 years, as the number of H2A and H2B visas issued by the State Department has tripled, and the number of wage theft investigators has remained steady. So again, you can kind of see the real challenge, even those that I think have good intentions, and they're completely outgunned, outmanned at places like Department of Labor. So foreign labor recruiters, transparency, registration, elimination of fees, and also enforcement, right? And registration and enforcement requires resources, which means funding. The other big area that you see over and over again is visa portability. And what that means is if you come on an H2A visa, you are tied at the hip with your employer. there's no ability to leave that employer unless you want to go home. One of the biggest indicators in this data set that Mica mentioned earlier from Polaris, who Polaris has really good data because they ran the National Human Trafficking Hotline. You know, they showed that the biggest, so there's three elements that you have with human trafficking. The use of force, fraud, or coercion in exchange for something of value. So coercion is a big aspect of trafficking, particularly labor trafficking. It's also really hard to prove. You know, coercion is a little more ambiguous, a little more gray. The number one use of coercion for those H-2 visas in the sample that Polaris did was the use of immigration enforcement, which mean either deportation or detention. And there's, again, real fear. This job is extremely important to these workers and also important for them sending money back home. And so visa portability is a really, really important aspect and a really needed reform. It will eliminate the kind of power disparity between the employer and the worker. It'll help kind of alleviate the vulnerability and exploitation. And so it's something that you see time and time again as a real challenge and concern when it comes to vulnerability and exploitation with labor trafficking. The other thing that I wanted to say was whistleblower protection. That's also important. There should be whistleblower protections for workers for these H-2s, for example, who assert their rights. Another area that has been recommended is legal services for H-2s. I think that's extremely unlikely in the current political environment, but it is another area where you could have real help in kind of addressing the power imbalance between the workers and the employers. The other thing that I would say, just a couple other things that there has been foreign labor recruiter legislation. It's been standalone bills. I have no doubt there'll be attempts to include foreign labor recruiter legislation in the next renewal of the Trafficking Victim Protection Act. But that's something that's really important to get behind. There's been various attempts at business transparency and supply chains transparency. That actually was something I was part of in 2000, I think it was 10, and it was both deliberate and targeting California because I think it was the 5th largest economy. Now it's, I think, the 4th largest I heard, but one wanted to target the 4th largest economy in the United States with transparency in supply chains. And also what we wanted to do is road test that legislation to show hopefully that it worked and it was able to be implemented. You know, it wasn't an undue burden on business. Everybody survived. Everybody continued to make money. And that has, I think, been really helpful to kind of build the case. That's often a strategy where you want to do something at the state level to show success, and then you scale it out to the federal level. So wanted to mention that. And then the other thing too, I think that's really important to understand is you can't address these changes in human trafficking legislation alone. We have to have, and you know, some of us have been trying to do this for decades, people long before me, but to have real immigration reform. So one of the big problems that we have, and this is not known to I think 99% of the people, but when we have the Trafficking Victim Protection Act and it's up for renewal, reauthorization, it goes to the House Foreign Affairs Committee on the House side to address the international component. Then it goes through Judiciary on the Senate side to address the domestic component. Well, each year or each time that it's up for renewal, there are not allowed to be any kind of immigration changes, even though immigration is a huge part of the trafficking issue, because if procedurally in Congress and the Senate, if you open something up for good, you open it up for bad. And so as soon as you offer, you know, what would be positive amendments to address immigration issues as they relate to human trafficking, labor trafficking, sex trafficking, then those that are for enforcement only and very opposed to immigration will put theirs on, and then you have the bill basically collapse under, you know, contentious provisions. And so really has to be addressed through immigration reform. The other thing that I think is just another dynamic that people aren't aware of is that the Biden administration has been really seeking to use H-2s as a path to, and I think this is really out of desperation and grasping at straws, but they want to use H-2s as an example of a legal pathway in the hopes to lessen the pressure on the border. And it's interesting because it hasn't really made it out into, you know, the media or the attention, but the immigrant rights and the trafficking groups have been opposed. more so they're saying, if you're going to use this as a path and increase the numbers, you need to have reforms, right? And so we may be okay with that, but you need to have reforms. And so that's another kind of political pressure that's going on in the big picture, which it makes it harder to have, I think, some reform stage twos. And the other thing I'll just mention, then I'm done, is that Trump administration, if they were to win, Trump command, they've released I think it's a 700-page report. If you haven't, you should at least skim through it or look at the table of contents. But one of the things, for example, there's a visa that victims of human trafficking can get if they agree to cooperate with law enforcement against their trafficker. They can get a T visa, a trafficking visa. So there's a whole, we could talk a lot about this and how those are provided and the amount of time and the turnaround. But they have said clearly, that they want to end all T visas. And so that's another example. And then last thing I would say is that, it's really important that you never have hierarchy in victims. If you care about victims, you care about victims, whether they're U.S. citizen, whether they're foreign national, whether they're sex or trafficking victims. And I also think it's extremely important. We talked about push factors and you can call it root causes, whatever you want. One of the big frustrations I have on policy over the years, you can have a 1,000-page immigration bill. 99% of it is reactive. It talks about the border, it talks about interior enforcement. Like 1%, maybe 2% will talk about root causes, the things that are increasingly pushing, Northern Triangle. Big change has been, you have a lot more women and children and families coming because of the corruption, because of the gang violence, because of the sex and gender-based violence against women by gangs. There's so little to address that. And that to me is the real hat trick, right? It's like, that's how you really want to solve something. You're preventing those things that are happening that are the push factors where, going back to what Erin talked about, is forced migration. So with that, I will close and hopefully we'll have some questions. So thank you.
Any questions?
Thank you so much. Cory, I
Just 1
gotta,
second.
oh, I'm sorry.
Oh,
Because we need.
forgot, can I mention just one thing before?
Thank you.
One thing real quick too, is that this slide, I'm an advocate too, and so I also want to give hope. I think that's really important to show that issues aren't intractable. This was part of a presentation that the CEO of Verite gave to my class about a month ago, and Verite does phenomenal work in labor trafficking and really empirically based on data. But I thought this was really hopeful when you look at from 2000 on, the TVPRA, and then different countries have passed really significant legislation, really important legislation. I just mentioned like the California Transparency in Supply Chains. But I just want to flag that because I think there's been incredible progress in the last 25 years, and in a quarter century, change is hard. Change takes a long time. But this is, I think, really promising and hopeful to see the kind of things that are going on. It's not perfect. There's still a lot more to do, but I think there's a really, there's a lot of hope here. So yes.
Thank you so much. Actually, my question was about this slide, because I worked for some years looking at the problems that the securitization of migration brings, especially in Europe. So the idea that migration is seen as a security threat. And so the response of the European Union was to create what they call the rings of security around the EU. So you would have like completely militarized responses to all types of migration phenomena, and complemented with a very aggressive peacekeeping and interventionist operations, especially in Africa. So I wanted to ask more about this because I see here, and you answered part of my question already, this is looking, I guess, at some European countries, the US, but I also wonder, when you look at this with your lenses of more of an advocacy and advice for decision makers, what can the so-called countries of origin do that moves us beyond a securitization of migration? I'm from Colombia, and we have a huge transit problem at the moment through the Darien Gap,
Mhm.
where we have people coming not just from Africa, but Asia, from South America, just using the country as the transit route. And it has opened the door for an incredible amount of abuse and violence on the side of the networks of not just human traffickers, but specifically sex traffickers.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I'll start and just say real quick, just using it, because it depends, right, on the country of origin or the region of origin. So there's different problems in different places. The place that I've spent the most time is Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador. And the problem there clearly, the really significant problem are the gangs, MS-13, and how they've become stronger than this central state government. They're non-state actors. Also the corruption. The corruption is a huge problem, and they're both intertwined. And through that, you have a lot of sex and gender-based violence. There's the issues like machismo and all that, but the violence and the corruption, the gangs are all tied. And I think that it's really important to address. And the corruption to me is the hardest one to tackle because it's infiltrated so many parts of society. They even will set up, fake NGOs that are all, part of this scheme. And so I think that's really difficult. Now, from a political perspective too, you have to address and have a serious, honest effort to address corruption if you want to get bipartisan support, the Republican support, right? And so that I think is also sequencing for that particular region that has been a big a source of push migration. So that's an example. I'll turn it over to you all for other thoughts.
I think just related to that also is, and I'm sure you know this, Safina, as well, but some of the challenges for these countries of origin actually are direct results for U.S. policy interventions by Western countries that have created the circumstances on the ground, right? And so I think there's also an obligation when thinking about root causes and looking at sort of what our roles have been and sort of the things that we've done and the conditions. I mean, MS-13 gangs actually originated in prisons in the United States, and then those people were deported back to these countries by the U.S. government, right? So I think it's not just help, it is helping these countries, and I think there's ways to think about directing foreign assistance and foreign aid. If you look at sort of the costs of the securitization and the militarization, right, the hardening of the border and enforcement, the amount of dollars that go into that could be sent instead to creating systems where people don't want to leave. So I think some of that has to do with sort of how we direct foreign assistance and how Europe directs its foreign assistance as well. And thinking about that. And then the other challenge of the securitization and then of the border is it actually then creates, because you don't have the ability to be transient. And what we've seen, 35 years ago on the US southern border, people would come over, work the day, and they would go back home at night, right? Now you get over and you can't go back, which actually then makes you more vulnerable to these nefarious labor traffickers because they're holding your immigration status over your head and you can't leave those situations because you're afraid you're going to be, because of how much we're so enforcement heavy. So that fear is very real and actually valid. And so that also becomes a way in which people don't report the violations or are more susceptible to being trafficked because of that, the lack of the ability to move across to really free movement.
And I'll just add to that, how countries of origin have been working with countries of destination is really through bilateral agreements, right? So we do have standards and conventions or recommendations that emanate from international institutions like the ILO and whatnot, but it's been perhaps a strategy of various countries of origin to really have these bilateral agreements with specific countries of destination to make it more particular to whatever industry, whatever need is being addressed. But my own belief that has been reflected in our experience with COVID is really how disposable bodies are at the moment of whatever, chaos, whatever, what have you, how disposable they are and how it's just left to the countries of origin to deal with it. The countries of destination will try to do something, but really, so for instance, there have been workers who they were transported from country of origin to work here in hospitality industries, and then March 20 happened, and then now, oh, sorry, our hotel is not operating, or our country club is not operating, you have no job. I don't know how you get home, but you gotta get home, you gotta get out here. It's, who's dealing with that? It's the nonprofits, it's the gap was filled by other actors. And really what we need to acknowledge is how, as emerging economies are filling in those jobs that are left empty in the global north, you could say, because of an aging population or what have you, especially when you look at caregiving or the caregiving industry and whatnot. There needs to be a better solution other than securitization and other than saying that, well, contract over, go, you know. Another thing I would talk about is perhaps the tragedy of the commons, where you have a feeling of like there's the wild, wild west that happens with online spaces and offshore spaces that are physical, but perhaps are legally nebulous, such as the high seas, so the fishing sector, or these exclusive economic zones within every country, where many of these scamming compounds have been located. They were, you know, a good number of them that were identified in Southeast Asia were actually in exclusive economic zones that were part of contracts with the Belt and Road projects of China, and, you know, taken advantage of by these criminal organizations. And I'm not saying that these exclusive economic zones are unique to the global south. We see a lot of this in all countries in the world, where because they are the laws are a little bit bent, or, you know, because it's an exclusive economic zone, the local laws around labor or are not the same. It's better to entice investment. So you will have criminal activity happening, whether it's in Europe or in the Americas or in Southeast Asia.
And the one thing too I would add is that I think it's important to keep in mind that, you know, a response to the solution can be often worse than the problem, like in El Salvador, where you have an authoritarian leader who has, you know, sought and expanded all sorts of powers, mass arrest. You know, I saw they had like a new law where they can try up to, I thought it was like a couple thousand at once. Clearly, there's a lot of human rights abuses. A lot of innocent individuals are being swept up that are not part of MS-13. And so I think, you know, through all this, we have to adhere to the rule of law, to justice, to basic human rights, all of that. So I think there's a danger in having kind of these demagogues and these authoritarian demagogues respond to some of these problems as we've seen.
Just had a question online.
Yes, we do. Yes, song. Okay, so I'm gonna combine a couple. These are all from Julie Kashke. The first is, what are the top 3 action items to take upon discovery of an act of human trafficking when identified at the roadside? And then to combine those, she asks, how can law enforcement communicate with a victim when the perpetrator is present? And specifically, what are some action items that the state of Illinois can implement for these traffic inspections?
What's the third question? What are the
some action items that the state of Illinois can implement upon roadside traffic inspections?
Well, I mean, I'll just start and say, you know, training is extremely important. It's really, really basic, but there's been a lot of good work with training. I think too that, you know, one thing I've seen even in my short time is that there's a sea change in law enforcement and working with victims and looking at victims as victims in the United States. It's not perfect. There's a lot of work that still needs to be done. But, you know, particularly when it comes to sex trafficking, women in sex work, that there's been a big change in viewing them as victims and looking and realizing ways that they need to help and work with the women to go after the perpetrators. I don't think any good law enforcement would ever have any kind of conversation or any kind of action with the trafficker present. So I think that's an unlikely scenario, and the trafficker would need to be removed from that situation. And I've seen plenty of these where sting operations, where they'll go out of their way to kind of disguise that, you know, they're arresting women, are going to the appearance of arresting women in case the trafficker, the pimp is watching, so they can then get them back and help them out, so they don't have trouble with the trafficker or the pimp. So, I mean, those are a couple quick thoughts. There's lots of really good training available. and happy, to get in touch with this person, to put them in touch with people that are in the business of doing that training.
I mean, I think the other thing we've also seen is there's the ability to, in some ways, to do sort of like signals. So if you're in like an active stop, there's a way to help law enforcement know how they might be able to sort of use nonverbal communications to signal a situation. You've seen that, I think, while human trafficking in many ways is very different from domestic violence, there's a lot of similarities with respect to law enforcement intervention strategies, particularly as you're trying to sort of move the person away from the perpetrator. And so I think there has been some training, cross-training that's been done in that space too. But just, I think, a general sense that, and I think this has been particularly true with the human trafficking legislation and training that's provided to law enforcement, particularly in the context of labor trafficking, helping them understand the dynamics of labor trafficking and how they're very similar in a lot of ways to sort of sex trafficking, and those are victims as well. And then, the other thing that's also, there are immigration protections for people who do cooperate with law enforcement. And so just making sure that law enforcement is aware of that. But I think a lot of it gets into a commitment by local and state law enforcement to sort of undergo these. And it's not just a one-time training, right? Continual training that's updated over time.
I'm aware that in Illinois, there has been a good bunch of training for law enforcement around trauma-informed interactions. And there's a way to also keep engaged with the communities through the Central Illinois Human Trafficking Task Force that covers the Central and Southern Illinois areas, and then the Cook County Human Trafficking Task Force, which kind of covers the Northern District. The reality is that with interactions with law enforcement, it can get really tricky because just the automatic how an individual might clam up when interacting with law enforcement, and law enforcement knows that. So there have been sting operations in Illinois that will involve nonprofit members for social services or for legal services who will be part of that sting operation or that recovery operation, so that there's a seamless kind of triaging with service providers to kind of help that individual open up when they're ready. The one important thing I think was which I've seen in my past work, even before this coming into this field, was traffic stops that would automatically connect with DHS or with immigration was a major issue. And so if we're thinking about trauma-informed interactions, we want to stop that kind of activity because if they're a trafficking survivor, and this is what's been happening, the phenomenon again of that overlapping with immigration issues, is that if they're identified as a foreigner or a undocumented person, then they are immediately deported or going through deportation proceedings. It's already produced harm in that individual, and they're never going to open up about their victimization. And that's something that happens here in the US. That's something that happens in other countries as well. So really want to kind of separate that issue.
Yeah. Hearing the news this morning that the UK has just passed this bill that they're going to export all their illegal immigrants to Rwanda. Been trying to do this for a while, and they finally just passed it. I was really interested that the rhetoric, that the rationale that was being used is this will prevent trafficking. This will be the message to the traffickers. Now, some of us tend to look at that thing, it's anti-immigrant, but to me, it sort of encapsulated the problem that it's a little bit hard to, if people say, well, this is against trafficking, and other people see a particular law or approach as against immigrants, how do you draw the line between those? Some of those really targeted policies that you were mentioning, Cory, clearly would address trafficking and not immigrants. They wouldn't be penalizing the immigrants, but obviously that kind of rhetoric is used in the US too. And what are the sort of ways that you can parse those out, or red flags of certain kinds of things that you would be able to point out to people that this is a law that's not going to address trafficking, but it will just harm immigrants?
Well, I think it's really important. There's a lot of really disingenuous actors and politicians that will talk about how they want to address like the flow to the southern border because they want to stop human trafficking. We're already, you know, everything there's a lot that's going on to working to address trafficking, right? And we have a lot of authorities, there's a lot of money, a lot to be done, but it's very disingenuous. And it really bothers me because it, you know, tries to cover you know, a hardline enforcement, anti-immigrant sentiment under this guise of like caring for human trafficking. And so it's definitely a problem. I think that what's important is, you know, that you still, if, you know, the groups largely that I think are doing the best work, of course, have a holistic approach. And they look at, you know, it's what I got at earlier, right? Like you have a holistic approach. If you care about trafficking, it doesn't matter who it happens to, right? And it doesn't matter if it's sex or labor. And there's no hierarchy of victims, right? No victim is any less or more important than any other victim. And so I think, you know, looking at that approach and a holistic approach, and that was what I was kind of trying to touch on too when we talked about, you know, kind of testing your policymakers or elected officials to see where they are when they say they're against human trafficking, to unpack that a little bit. So I think it's really important, you know, that they have a holistic approach. They look at all facets of human trafficking and that there's no hierarchy or difference in how they look at or address victims. Because the thing you see quite often, and it was, you know, very prominent among the Trump administration, is a singular focus on U.S. citizen girls and sex trafficking. And that is immediately a red flag to me, of course, any kind of singular focus where you don't have an inclusive approach. Because again, if you're, you know, trafficking is horrible, right? And any kind of exclusion is a red flag.
Yeah, and I think the other thing to also keep in mind is that, you know, the definition of human trafficking, we talked a lot about migration, particularly in the context of labor trafficking, right? But a lot of, you know, you don't have to necessarily cross an international border to be trafficked. I think that's really important to remember. And I think that human traffickers, and this is what I will also say, and I've seen this in the United States, until we address the root causes of why people are coming, people will continue to come. And if you're sort of focusing on sort of the securitization, militarization, trying to shut down known pathways of transit, things just go further underground and people become even more vulnerable to exploitation, right? And so, you know, I just think that rhetoric is really disingenuous, and it's not, because everyone will say they're against human trafficking, right? But then what does it mean to really be against it? I think we know what needs to happen to stop it, and deporting people is not one of those factors.
I can try to speak then. This is mainly for Mica. I was curious if you had seen, or if you could tell us a bit about whether there's been a response to some of these trends that you mentioned. So this really high mortality rate within the agricultural sector, and just the inadequacy of social distancing measures. Are we now seeing preventative measures for future outbreaks or any long-term changes? What does that look like?
So definitely, CDC has changed its stance, and then through the current administration, there's been more preventative or protective measures in place around this issue. And more. I think there's been more receptivity to or better reception around the needs of workers, whether or not, no matter what their status is. So instead of being a state level response from the beginning, it's now more of there's guidance at the federal level, but you know, there's also been challenges to the kind of federal response, challenges in the courts about, is this constitutionally this and that, which, you know, which I prefer there is for OSHA, for occupational safety and health measures. Now, the Department of Labor is, they recently had a comments, they recently had new regulations suggested that they open for public comments. I think it was either late last year or early this year. And so pretty soon there's going to be more revisions that we will see coming down the pipeline. But the reality is labor, this whole area of, it's not just trafficking labor as well. It's, I don't know why it's highly politicized, unlike, yeah. So it kind of changes, the regulations change, and because it's under the administration, it changes with every. So it was different under the former administration, it was different under the administration before that.
Yeah, I mean, I would say a lot of immigration and labor laws, most of sort of how they're executed are regulatory, they're not legislative. I mean, there is like legislative frameworks and then regulatory practices come out, but you know, anytime you've got heavy regulatory matters, they are sort of, most of that power is vested in the executive branch. So as with those shifts, you see those changes. Norbert.
Yeah, sure. Well, both of you, Cory and Erin, you've addressed or spoken a little bit about addressing root causes, right? And I was wondering if you could expand a little bit upon that, because the moment we touch upon that, we are talking usually about international questions, which adds an altogether different level of complexity. And I know, for example, is at the moment also is a big question, big debate in Europe. And I was wondering, yeah, if you could expand upon that a little bit.
I mean, you know, given the example, just stick with the example of the Northern Triangle, there has been efforts and funding from the administration to address some of the issues like gangs and the judicial system. There's a lot of issues too with you know, the independence of judges and dealing with corruption and violence against judges is you know, it's a kind of familiar, unfortunately, game plan. And you know, the U.S. Administration has done around $1 billion each year. Now that's in one way sounds great, but then you know, it's only 300 million for each country. And while it's great that there's that focus, and I applaud them for that, I really think you have to have you know, a greater and more significant amount of funding to really address the issues. And here's what I would say is that when you look at what we're spending, reacting year after year on the southern border, that I absolutely believe that investments to address these push factors would be much cheaper than the reaction on the border. You know, and to me, I don't think that's ideological. I think it's facts. When you look at the amounts in the budget, so those are examples. You know, and they've actually have done things. And I will say, you know, even you know, the Republican senator from Indiana, Todd Young, has been, I think, a leader and really understands and gets this to deal with the root causes as well. And so, you know, there are elements there and signs of hope, but, you know, it needs to be a greater amount of funding and a much bigger effort.
Yeah, I just think at least see ourselves as more and more global, right? It's not so much that it's a particular nation state or sovereign's responsibility to make sure that human dignity is, right, protected. So I think we all have like a collective responsibility to sort of addressing these things, both from sort of a pragmatic perspective in not wanting flows to, but also from, I think, a moral perspective as well. But I think investments in local solutions is also really important when you're thinking about how you're directing foreign assistance, right? So you're not just giving it to the governments. I know with the root cause legislation, there's been, particularly with the sex and gender-based violence, there's been a lot of work on working with people on the ground who sort of know what's needed and what's lacking to inform, you know, do we need more domestic violence shelters? Do we need more training for law enforcement? Do we need training for schools? Another big area for training, I think, is the medical profession. For trafficking as well. So those are the kind of investments you can think about making.
Yeah, and I mean, the regional approach is really, really important. I always focus on U.S. policy, and so I always kind of quickly talk about Congress administration, but like with the Northern Triangle, the Organization of American States, for example, there's a lot of importance that they have in this, and it has to be, you know, of course, it can't just be the U.S., you know, it has to be those national governments. And, you know, there's a lot of deliberate effort not to give money directly to the governments because of the corruption issue, right? But that is where I feel for the policymakers that have good intentions, because the corruption issue is a real problem, and you want to make sure that the money gets to where it's needed. And the last thing you want, if you care about this, is to have some scandal where all, you know, X percentage of the funding was siphoned off, you know, for MS-13 and corrupt officials or something like that.
Well, I have a question also in relation to what you were saying at the beginning, Erin. You were saying that we have an international legal framework, you know, that was created after the Second World War, that, you know, creates UNHCR and creates other commissions and laws that, were responding to the Holocaust and to the creation of the State of Israel and to a lot of very different situation of migration, especially coming from the war. And, we hear a lot of criticism saying this framework does not respond to a lot of things that we're seeing today because of these 5 reasons for migration. So if you had any impact on this global framework, what do you think that should be things that we can think within international legal frameworks that would help us be more responsive, but also to be given much more sustainable answers to migration?
Well, I think one thing to think about is migration doesn't have to be in or out. It can be a continuum of protection. So I think oftentimes, for so long, it was either you are a refugee or you aren't a refugee, because if you are, certain legal protections attached based on the convention and the rights that flow from that convention and the signatories of the convention. But I think one really good example, right, is the Europeans' response to Ukrainian migrants fleeing Russian occupation, right? So they actually changed how they received individuals, and it's actually come out of Bosnia and Herzegovina. They passed a resolution that basically gave them regional power to not force migrants to seek asylum in their first country of origin, but to decide where they wanted to go in Europe. They also broadened the definition of who constituted as a family member. And they allowed people to work right away and access social services if they could just show they were from Ukraine, right? And so where there was a political will, that the EU absorbed upwards of 8 million refugees in less than a year, right? And yet we're clamoring at 400,000 on the southern border. So I think some of it is you can think about protection as it doesn't have to be in or out, but there can be temporary protection, there can be benefits that you can attach. I mean, I think one of the biggest challenges in the United States is you can't work while you're seeking refugee status. You're not allowed to access any federal benefits. So what do? You can't work, you can't earn a living, and you can't access, food stamps or any kind of housing assistance or anything where your claims are being adjudicated. So I think, and I also think one of the things that's changed, particularly with the global compact, discussions, is this idea of burden sharing, right? So the countries on the receiving end, the reality is that 83% of refugees are in the global south, right? I mean, it's the neighboring countries that are absorbing the flow. So how do we collectively, as a world, help mitigate the burdens that are on those countries as well? But I don't think you necessarily need to open up the refugee definition, but I think you can sort of think about other ways in which you can provide protection that's grounded in a rights-based approach.
I just want to add on that note, what some of us did in the state of Illinois was because of this gap between seeking protection and the processing of the visas or the humanitarian visas. There was that gap of inability to access social services, whether under VAWA or the U or the T, and or refugee status was through the state. Bill was passed so that it was the state that would come in and financially support that while they're waiting, but that had to be a state response.
Just a quick question for Cory. You had mentioned a couple really common sense solutions to the problems posed by labor recruiters. And I was curious, besides the issue around getting political will for funding, what are some of the challenges to get those solutions passed?
Yeah, it's, unfortunately, it's the same thing, right? Because there's the registration, the transparency, the banning of fees, transparency, registration of fees, disclosure, that's the same as transparency, registering with DOL, and then, enforcement, real enforcement. Those are all have been included in legislation and also added to the TVPRA. And the problem is that they're opposed by business interests and those that rely on foreign labor recruiters to bring in, workers for H2 and H2B. And so they have a potent kind of political force. And, particularly when you're facing you could get something through if it was a Democratic House on the House side, but you always have to get the 60 in the Senate, and you can't get there. And so, outside of doing some things around the edges, you could do some things through executive actions, but to have kind of real change, you need law. And so until, and this is part of what I've seen and what I say on immigration, things that are immigration related, that the root problem that we have in a lot of these issues that results in trafficking is immigration law and immigration reform. The problem is, it used to be 15 years ago when I worked on immigration reform, you had a band of Republican senators like Senator DeWine from Ohio, Senator Brownback from Kansas, Senator Voinovich from Ohio, Senator Collins, who's still around, and Maine, Senator Snow, where they would support immigration. Now you don't have that. And so, what I look at this now is there's no needle, there's no way to thread the needle to get bipartisan support because it's become so politicized. So it's really a political problem where you have to have a change in the Senate as a body. If you have a House that's Democratic, I'm making that assumption, but because I've seen it where there's no negotiation, there's no middle ground now. And so it has to change. And that's what has to happen. The presidents can only do good or bad so much on immigration. I mean, Erin's touched on that. You really have to have, a law that's passed that's comprehensive.
We've got one more online question. This is from Anthero Afiku, and he is asking how to tackle the corruption and complicity in government agencies when it comes to security, border, and roadside control.
I think it's a really, really good question. It's a really important question. It's the thing I've struggled with. When I've looked at recommendations, just using the case example again of the Northern Triangle, it's very, very difficult, because the corruption is so pervasive and it evolves, and they'll find ways if you move away from giving funding to the states, the government, then they move to non-state civil society NGOs. I mean, I've seen where they set up NGOs that are like not real, so they can like siphon funding away, the MS-13, the gang. So I think it's an extraordinary problem, and it's the thing that I really have a hard time figuring out because it's so pervasive.
Yeah, I think the other thing is, and this is slow change, right? This is structural change. I mean, you have to sort of provide other incentives or other ways in which people can see themselves as successful, see themselves as contributing, see themselves as important. I mean, a lot of corruption is really about power differential, right? And about access to power and access to control. And corruption, I think, also flourishes in places where there's lots of discretion. Now, I'm a big believer in giving discretion in decisions in the immigration context and in a lot of the but I think it's also really important to have accountability for people who are state actors. And that means like police, that means and I think corruption can manifest itself in multiple ways. It can be siphoning off of funding, it can be an abuse of discretion in a way that makes it less likely that someone's going to actually use law enforcement to report crime. So I think these are real big structural issues that require, I think, long-term thinking and but that's why we have a peace studies program here, right? To address these structural violence issues.
Yeah, I just would add one thing too. I know we're at time, but I think the other, trick is when you look at Central America and Mexico is that I think, there's an unsaid tension and kind of concern that they don't want to go too hard against these governments in the area because they can open up the flow, right? And so you go too hard on the El Salvadoran leader, he won't play ball, right? I mean, you've had some concerns about that in Mexico. And so there's also that dynamic as well, where I think sometimes, you don't have as much pressure and enforcement and kind of US pressure on things like corruption with someone, because I think there's concerns about how that will play out. And that's always such a political issue now, right? With the border and with elections.